So it seems like there's still a lot of confusion about the different types of research, and I think part of the issue might be that we're not really clear on variables and how variables might vary and how that's going to impact what kind of study it is. So I just thought I'd throw together this quick video to look at the different kinds of variables and how it's going to impact our categorization. So in any study, the most important variables are going to be the independent or predictor variable and the dependent or criterion variable. And those names don't actually mean anything. For experiments, we call them independent and dependent variables, and for predictive or explanatory non-experiments, we call them predictor and criterion variables. For descriptive studies, we just call them variables. There's no distinction because the variables don't do anything. They're just there to describe things. But for experiments and predictive and explanatory non-experiments, we distinguish between them this way. That said, it's not a huge deal if you get those confused. So, for example, if you call an predictor variable an independent variable, that's not a big deal. It's more of a big deal if you call an independent variable a predictor variable, but really it's not a huge deal either way. You can use whatever terminology you really feel more comfortable with. The important thing is that dependent or criterion variables are the thing that we're interested in as an outcome. They're the change we want to see in the world, whether that's academic achievement or motivation or reading skills or whatever. It's the outcome that we are interested in. Independent or predictor variables are the things that we think may have a relationship or otherwise affect that outcome. There are points of interest in essentially explaining or predicting that outcome variable. Now, those two main types of variables are the most important in any study, but they're not the only variables in any study. There are a bunch of others that may or may not be relevant for the study you're looking at. Nuisance or confounding variables we talked about last week, and they're the things that might impact the DV, the dependent variable or the criterion variable, besides the independent variable. And that might mess up our interpretation of the data. So we want something that, in order to be a nuisance variable, it has to really impact that outcome. Controlled or partial variables are ones that didn't show up in the reading, but which I'm highlighting here because they're basically nuisance variables, but that the researchers have accounted for in some way. So they're no longer something to worry about. So when the researchers use randomization, they're controlling for certain variables. Sometimes those are going to be measured and sometimes they're not, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And then finally we have explanatory variables. These are sometimes called mediator or moderator variables because they basically explain the relationship between the independent predictors or the dependent criterions. They're used to provide some sort of understanding of the data, some sort of explanation of why or how something happens. To put it another way, any study, except a descriptive study, is doing some version of this, of how one thing affects another thing, how independent variables impact dependent variables, how predictors predict criterions, etc. All the other things that they measure in the study essentially come in between that independent and dependent variable box. So what either explains or confounds our understanding of the independent-dependent relationship. So nuisance variables, like we talked about, if they impact the relationship that the independent has on the dependent, then that confuses us and doesn't let us truly say that the independent variable properly explains or predicts or causes the dependent variable, because there's this other variable that's messing things up. Controlled variables are, as I mentioned, things that they have looked at and that they have accounted for in some way. So in an experiment, in a true experiment, that's done through randomization. They control for basically everything through randomization. And then they don't necessarily list all the things they controlled for because randomization takes care of a lot. But for non-experimental or quasi-experimental studies, anything that you want to measure, anything you want to account for, you have to actually measure. So those are going to be directly measured. And whether they account for that through things like design methods, as we talked about last week, so say having an equal number of boys and girls in each category in a quasi-experiment, you could do that. Or you could do that statistically. So when you read phrases like we controlled for X or we partialed out variance due to X, that's what they're talking about. And then finally, explanatory variables are ones that are also measured, but what the researchers use them instead of being nuisance variables, that the researchers are trying to control for by design or statistically. What explanatory variables do are they explain how or why something happened, how that independent variable predicts that dependent variable, how that predictor works with that criterion. So when a variable is used to answer the question of how this works, we know that this predictor is an association. How come? That's an explanatory variable. Now, what this means in terms of types of studies is that when we're categorizing the kind of study we're looking at, we want the main focus to be on what the independent or predictor variables are and what the dependent or criterion variables are. It may even be helpful if you want to list them as you're reading a study. If what they're doing is comparing groups as an independent variable, then they're probably doing an experiment or quasi-experiment. If they're not comparing groups as the main focus, then it's probably not an experiment. But then this can also get tricky because a study can have multiple independent variables or multiple predictors, which may also be related to one another. In that case, each independent or predictor variable functions both as an IV predictor and as an explanatory variable, depending on which is the focus of that particular analysis. Now, normally when you actually read the study, it's not actually that confusing when you read it, because in the moment of reading, you understand what the focus is at any given time. If they've written it with like a bare level of competence, you should understand what the focus is at any given point in time. But it is confusing if you're trying to use this as a method to categorize studies, because if there's two categorical variables, if there's two variables that are in groups, then okay, it's probably an experiment with two independent variables. And if there are two things that are not in group, then you can probably be like, oh yeah, so there's our two predictors, and that makes sense. And it's not an experiment. But when one is in groups and one isn't, it gets really, really tricky to tell the difference. Essentially, you have to look at which one is the more dominant in any analysis. So the conclusion that you would draw from that would be that if they're in groups, it's an experiment or a quasi-experiment. If they're not in groups, then it's non-experimental, either explanatory or predictive. And that's fine for now. Honestly, if you come away with that thinking for now, that's totally fine. Stop the video here. That's totally, totally okay. It's a little more nuanced than that, and in 2 weeks we'll spend a lot more time talking about that nuance. I'm going to give a quick overview of it here for those of you who just don't feel satisfied with, don't worry about it as an answer, which I totally understand. I also hate that as an answer. So feel free to stop right now if you feel like you're okay with the amount of information you currently have. But for those who want a little more, we're going to keep going. And so what this essentially tells us is that all variables fall into two overall types. They're either categorical or continuous. And then within each of those types, we further break it down into nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And so what I mean by that all variables fall into these types is that there are really only 4 ways to measure things. All the tests we do, all the groups we have, all the measurements we take are one of those 4 types of measurements: nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Nominal and ordinal scales, you'll remember, are categorical. In a nominal scale, that's when you have a category or you have categories, but those categories don't hold any inherent value. So gender is an example of a nominally measured thing. So people are either male, female, and of course that's not actually true, but for the sake of this argument, we're going to say that's what it is. So gender, one isn't inherently better than the other. It's just a category. Same thing with, for example, numbers on sports jerseys. Number 77 isn't necessarily better than number 76. That's not how they assign those numbers. It's just a label. It's just a label on a group. Same thing with your social insurance number. And importantly, the same thing with a treatment or control group. Of course, if we're doing a true experiment, we want to eventually show that the treatment group does better than the control group, but there's no inherent value before you start the study in being in the treatment or control group. Ordinal scales are rankings. So if you came first in your class, the stoves on low, medium, or high, even letter grades like A, B, C, etc., they're all on what are called an ordinal scale. That's where things are ranked, but still within categories. So placing first is better than placing second, the stove being on high is hotter than the stove being on low, but the distance between those rankings don't really matter. So it's still in sort of rough groupings where the difference between them isn't steady. So you come in second place whether you miss first by 1 second or by 10 seconds. 71 and a 77 are both Bs, but a 68 is a C and in a lower group, even though it's actually closer to 71 than 71 is to 77. So an ordinal scale are groups that are ranked is essentially the way to look at it. Interval and ratio scales are very similar, and I'm not going to talk about the difference between interval and ratio at this point. We'll talk about that later, and it's too confusing to go into right now. But for both of them, they're anything that has a meaningful difference between points on a scale. So they are no longer categorical. Now we're talking about a continuous variable where each point is a meaningful change in state. So temperature, for example, if you go up 1 degree in temperature, if you go from 1 to 2 degrees and then you go from 5 to 6 degrees, that's the same interval. That's the same meaningful change of 1 degree. And then you can break that down into smaller pieces. You can go up 1.1 degrees or 1.01 degrees. It's an interval where you can measure a precise point along the scale. Both of them are ways you can measure a precise point along a scale, and that the intervals between those pieces matter. Okay? And so the reason this matters is that the type of study can really only, certain types of studies can only address certain types of scales, certain types of ways of measuring. Dependent variables can use any of these types of ways of measuring. You can have a nominal dependent variable, you can have an ordinal dependent variable, you can have an interval or ratio dependent variable. Same thing for criterion variables. They can be nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. And ditto for predictors. They can be nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. For independent variables, though, when we're in a true experiment, they can only be nominal. So an independent variable, the main focus has to be on a category. And for a true experiment, it can only be things that aren't ranked. It has to be a randomly assigned group, right? So if it's a randomly assigned group for an independent variable, that means it has to be on a nominal scale. So you are always comparing groups in an experiment. For a quasi-experiment, you can use things on a nominal scale or an ordinal scale. So you can compare students in the C range to students in the B range, but it has to be a direct comparison. It still has to be a category, and you have to be comparing directly those categories. Now, overall, you don't have to worry too much about these specific categories right now, but the important thing to think is that for they're going to be meaningful when we talk about the types of statistics you're going to use, and they're going to be meaningful when we talk about how you display that data. But they don't really matter for critique, except that identifying the variables can sometimes help when you're figuring out whether something is an experiment. Because an experiment, as I said, has to be a comparison of these categorical ones, the nominal or ordinal scales. Non-experimental can be any. So all you're really doing when you identify that something has been used in groups is if you identify that something's on an interval or ratio scale, so it's on a continuous scale, then you can eliminate experiments if the independent variable is on an interval or ratio scale. You can eliminate experiments, but if the independent or predictor variable is along those, is a categorical variable, then you still have to do a little more thinking to determine what are they actually doing here. So the short answer is yes, if they're comparing groups, you can probably say they're an experiment. The long answer is sometimes. That's only true if the other things aren't true, which I realize is not very helpful. But hopefully this clears up a little bit in terms of experiments versus non-experiments.